Hey, what's up, guys? It's Bakes here, and thank you for joining me for this episode of my random horror reviews. Today's movie is actually one that I spoke about in a video pretty recently. Obviously, it wasn't dedicated to this film in particular, but brought it up not too long ago. Today's movie is from last year, 2023, and it is VHS 85. This is the sixth and latest installment in the series. It would have been last month or something. I ranked the VHS franchise from my least favorite to favorite installment, and I think I had this one somewhere around the middle. I'll link that video in the description if I remember to do so. But I felt like rewatching it, even though I only saw this one for the first time last year, which on the grand scheme of things isn't that long ago. I did feel like checking it out again. Normally this is the part where I'd go into the plot, but because it's an anthology film, it is a little bit hard to get down to the nitty gritty of the plot because there are several stories going on, so I guess I'll sort of go through them as we go into the review, but all the stories obviously take place in 1985. It tries some new approaches with the structure compared to previous entries in the franchise as well, so it's got a few different things going for it, but overall we might as well not beat around the bush and let's get into my thoughts of 2023's VHS 85. So like I said in my introduction, or I guess in the video where I ranked the franchise as well, when this movie came out last year, I remember it having a fair bit of hype around it. I remember a lot of people really digging it, though when I watched it for the first time last year, I thought it was good, just not great. I definitely felt like more people enjoyed it more than what I did, but still was a solid enough watch. But this time upon rewatch, I definitely enjoyed it more. Still not a smash hit or anything. I still feel like people would enjoy it more than me, even after my second time viewing, but it definitely was a step up for me. Firstly, I feel like it didn't feel as long of a runtime this time around. This movie clocks in at just under 2 hours. And though it didn't fly by or nothing, I was surprised when I checked the time, as I was going through this movie, and it was already over halfway. I was like, okay, fuck, it's definitely not dragging as much as it did the first time for myself. This movie changes up the structure compared to the earlier installments in the franchise as well. And what I mean by that is, just off the top of my head, I could be wrong, and if I am wrong, correct me in the comments, feel free to. But I believe this was the first film in the series to have segments tie in together to make a continuous story, which I think is a pretty cool change, just keeping it fresh, trying something a little bit different. I think that's pretty neat. And it was also the first to make a wraparound with something other than people stumbling upon the tapes, watching them, and then that gives us our segments. That's normally how the wraparounds work in the previous installments, but both of those changes, though it's nothing that's going to blow your mind and it's not reinventing the wheel or anything like that, it's something to keep it fresh and something a little bit different for a franchise that is now at its sixth installment. So starting with the wraparound segment in this movie before I get into the individual segments and stories, it probably is, in my opinion, the best wraparound segment throughout the whole VHS franchise, because all of the other earlier movies, it's pretty much just people, usually cops or some sort of officials, finding these tapes, sliding them in, and then that's how our segments start. But this one does something completely different. And it actually doesn't lead into any of the stories. It pretty much is its own story, just broken up, which is probably my least favorite thing about it, because it's actually pretty engaging, but it keeps stopping and starting between the other stories. But getting into the actual story itself, it's pretty cool how it's shot like a TV documentary. I like the idea of this shape-shifting TV watching blob. I think that's all pretty interesting. But again, having it broken up is my biggest issue with the wraparound. They might as well have made it into its own full segment, because like I said, it doesn't lead into any of the stories anyway, so why not just get rid of the wraparound in general? I actually am a huge fan of wraparounds or something to tie an anthology together. So it's weird saying just get rid of the wraparound, but in this situation, the story isn't adding anything by being a wraparound, so why just get rid of it in general and not do it at all and make it its own full segment? So moving on to the actual first segment of the movie, it's about a group of friends spending a day at the lake and hanging out on the water. but then they end up getting taken out by someone with a sniper on the shore. But then there's also something going on with the water, which I won't spoil because I think it's a pretty cool twist and a pretty cool reveal that you guys should see for yourself. But this one is probably my overall favourite segment for the entire movie. First of all, I just really like the location and the fun out on the water and day out vibes that the earlier part of the segment has. But then once the shooter comes into play, it actually becomes pretty suspenseful. But then the twist also comes into play, which again I won't spoil, but it adds some really cool gore, which I always appreciate. And this segment is also an example of what I was saying in the introduction about stories that later tie into another segment to make a continuous story. And that is a pretty cool part of this story, and it tries something a little bit different, which is nice. But moving on into the second segment, which is a little bit weird because we've gone from my favourite segment to my least favourite segment. This one is about a news and rescue crew stuck in the rubble of a suspected earthquake. This one gives me a little bit of Wreck vibes. It being a foreign segment plays into that, but then also obviously you have the character occupations, which also have similarities to Wreck as well. But obviously, as you can tell, I don't think it's as good as Wreck. Me saying it's probably my least favourite segment in this movie. Just overall, I find it kind of boring until the reveal of what's actually going on. What I mean by that is, spoilers, it's not an earthquake, but I'm not going to spoil what it is. And I think that's pretty cool, but as I said, it takes a little while to get there. I don't really enjoy the parts where they're just stumbling through the rubble and everything. I like the climax. I think the reveal is pretty cool, but other than that, it takes a little while to get there, and like I said, it's probably my least favourite segment. So moving on to the third story, which is probably the segment that grew on me the most from my first time watching this movie. It's about a chick doing this presentation and summoning a technology demon, which sounds a little bit out there, I know, but by the end of it, I thought it was pretty cool. Honestly, it does start out kind of boring. The chick doing the presentation does a lot of rambling. It's almost coming across as like preachy. And for a while, it is a bit, what the fuck, and where is this going? And you're like, okay, move it along, move it along. But by the climax of this segment, it is really fucking cool, and it's got the best gore and gore effects throughout this whole movie. Like, by the time it gets to that part, I'm like, damn, that was like almost worth all the rambling. Maybe not, because it does ramble for a little while, and you're like, okay, but by the end of it, it's really fucking cool. I also dug the whole VR sets before VR sets. Like I said, this story has a big, topic of technology on it. But it does this whole VR sets before VR sets were a thing. Obviously, this film wasn't actually made in 1985, so it didn't predict the future of tech or anything like that. But I dug the performance fictional origins of, like I said, VR sets, and this guy wears these goggles, and he calls them his iPhones, which I think is a pretty cool pun. Obviously, takes place before the iPhone, but he's calling them his I'm explaining something you guys get, but I thought that was all pretty fun and, added something to the segment as well. Then moving on to the fourth segment, which is actually the continuation of the first story, and I do like it a lot. I don't like it as much as the first segment, but I think it is a good conclusion and does continue that story pretty well. I won't go into it because it actually spoils the twist and reveal of the first one, but it's pretty much another perspective spin-off of what's going on in the first segment, and I think the twist of the first segment plays into it really well. But like I said, it's a hard one to go into because it gives away what happens at the end of the first, but trust me, I really dug it. So moving on to the fifth and final segment in this movie, about a pair of cops who are receiving these videotapes in the mail containing footage of people getting murdered, point of view style. And the catch is these tapes are actually taking place a little bit forward in the future before anything has actually happened, which I think is a pretty cool twist. This also goes in a really neat direction involving dreams and premonitions, which I think is fun. But then I might also add that the murders that are taking place on these tapes point of view style are also really brutal, so it also adds in some really cool gore effects as well. I remember my first time watching this segment last year, obviously, like I said, being able to guess who was doing the murders. So that took a little bit off the segment for myself because a big part of it is the mystery of who is doing these murders. But then obviously watching it for a second time round for this review, 100% knowing who was doing the murders, again, it doesn't really add a lot because a big part of it is the mystery. But I still think this one is pretty cool. I know for a fact a lot of people say that this is their favourite segment through the whole movie. For me personally, it probably falls around the middle. But overall, it's still pretty solid, pretty entertaining, and a fun one to conclude the movie. But wrapping it up, it's a solid enough installment in the franchise. Still not an individual favourite for me. Like I said in my introduction, I can pretty much guarantee that still a majority of people would like it more than I do, but definitely grew on me, and I enjoyed it more upon this second time watch. I know I said through most of the segments, so I might as well sum it up all together now. Really good gore effects through this whole movie, which I think is pretty cool. And I think a lot of people will be surprised with some notable horror directors that did segments in this movie. You have Scott Derrickson, you have David Bruckner. So, it's not like a bunch of nobodies making segments either. I'm not calling anybody nobodies or whatever, but there's a bit of credit to people making these stories if you haven't checked out some of the later VHS films. It had some pretty cool changes with the structure, having some stories tied together, having a wraparound that doesn't actually lead into the segments themselves, which I thought was pretty cool. But I'm just rambling now. I might as well get into the rating for VHS 85. I'm thinking really close to a 7, but for now I'm going to go with a 6.5. I think there's room to grow on me, but a 6.5 for VHS 85. Like I said, I'm just happy that I did enjoy it more upon rewatch. Like I said, the first time I watched it, I didn't think it was bad or anything. I just think it was one of those things, other people liked it more than me, but I don't know, maybe next time it'll grow on me more and more. But for now, solid enough watch, definitely would recommend it still. But let me know your thoughts of VHS 85 in the comments below if you have seen this movie. And like always, guys, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you for another review soon.